Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome, and in many cases, welcome back to this, our third Baltic colloquium. My name is Brendan Sims. I'm welcoming you wearing three hats. The first is that I'm a fellow of this college, which has existed since 1284. I arrived here in 1989 as a graduate student, 35 years ago, which is a long time. And in fact, before some of the states we'll be talking about existed in their current form, so that dates me somewhat. The second hat I'm wearing is that I'm the director of the Center for Geopolitics. Our USP, if you will, is a focus really on two things. One is history, that you need to understand the history of a region or of a problem to understand its significance today. And secondly, the importance of region or of space. In other words, you need to know the region, you need to read the languages, you need to go into the archives. And therefore, it's very appropriate that the topic of our colloquium today is the 2014 revolution in Ukraine and its relationship to the Baltic Sea region. So it is both history, but for obvious reasons, also contemporary politics. And the third hat I wear is that I co-direct, together with Charles Clarke, the Baltic Geopolitics program within the Center for Geopolitics, which of course organize this event. And with that, I hand over to Charles.
Well, Brendan, firstly, thank you for that welcome, and can I echo his welcome to all of you here. As Brendan says, this is the third of our international symposia. We're delighted with them. I always feel a sense of friendship when people gather together, some old friends, but people working very determinedly to try and put those principles that Brendan described into action. It's now 3.5 years since we launched the Baltic Geopolitics program. If you want to find more details of it, there are copies of this brochure on the desk at the front. And the principles are as Brendan describes. Firstly, we're very much founded in history. We believe it's very, very difficult to understand current geopolitical challenges without understanding the history of the circumstances. Secondly, we've always sought to engage a wide range of different disciplines, not purely academic, but also governmental, diplomatic, military, and so on, because we think all have a contribution to make to the understanding of the issues concerned. Thirdly, we focus on the whole of the Baltic Sea region. So that's not simply the 3 Baltic states, but also the countries right around the Baltic Sea area. And we've had a lot of support from countries, and there are many people here from that range of countries. And then fourthly, we always try and look at the UK relationship with those countries, which is a long and historical one, sometimes a troubled set of relationships. And then finally, we're ready to examine any subject, but always from the point of view of its geopolitical implications, which I think echoes the point that Brendan makes. In our world today, we really need much better level, higher quality discussion of the geopolitical challenges facing the world. We see the threats that we're under in a wide variety of different contexts, and we need to do that more widely. We have 2 postdoc researchers, junior research fellows, Donatas Kupciunas, who many of you know, he's sitting at the back there in a rather shadowy way, ready to seize upon any particular comment that anybody wants to make. He is the person who's put the most effort into creating the program that we're going to discuss in a moment. And I want just publicly to thank you, Donatas, for all the creative force that you have put into this event that we're having today. And we're very fortunate since Christmas of being joined by Trevelyan Wing, a second postdoctoral researcher. I don't know, Trevelyan, who's a very retiring type of chap, tries to hide himself behind the pillar so nobody will notice him. But he's a fantastic addition to our team and is covering a wide range of different aspects of interest to us. So we're gradually building our capacity. We've had an enormous number of events since we began, over 60 altogether, some online, some in person, in various places, many in Cambridge, of course, but also right round the Baltic Sea region, in capitals and other countries there, often in partnership with our collaborators who are here. And we do seek to collaborate with a network of 20 universities around the Baltic Sea region. Many of them are represented in the room now, and you all know how we value these relationships, sometimes to organise a seminar, sometimes to organise a summer school, or whatever. And that has increased our capacity to show what we're going to do much more fully. I also just want to pay a word of thanks now for our supporters and donors, some of whom are in the room. I won't name anybody now, but we've had tremendous support from people who have made it possible for us to operate. Now, I then come to the programme for today, which is here. When I finish this introduction, we'll move straight to the panel on Baltic perspectives from Tallinn to Warsaw, chaired by my colleague Hugo Bromley, and that will last for the hour and a quarter anticipated. Then at 10:45, I will introduce Kathy for her keynote presentation. She should have arrived by then. So we're switching those two sessions at the beginning of the day. And there are one or two other changes that will arise in the programme. We'll go through them as we operate. Now, in terms of the way the rest of the day goes, we'll essentially be in this hall, wonderful old hall, throughout the day, with coffee, tea and so on, and lunch in the room behind, which is called the Lubbock room, and you're welcome to whatever you want to eat and drink through that process. And secondly, we will then go at the end through the back of the college to the Graduate Hotel, which is next door, to have a reception and then a symposium dinner for all of you who can stay. Unfortunately, we can only admit those who've actually said yes, which is a large number of you here, but we've got limitations on the number of tables and so on that we've got. I should say we aren't aware of any emergencies taking place, so there won't be any fire drills. I should also say that, as you can see, we have at the back cameras taking place for a video of this event, and it will all take place online. And so you should be aware that anything you say could potentially be on our online event. So with that, I welcome you to this event and ask Hugo Bromley and his first panel to come up to the front, please, to kick us off. There's Hugo. Would you come through to the front?
Okay, so thank you all very much for coming, as others have said. As Charles described so vividly, we've had to change the sessions around a bit. But I think it's appropriate, given that we are the Baltic Geopolitics program, that we are now starting with Baltic perspectives on 2014 and the 2014 revolution in Ukraine. I'm delighted to be joined by a panel that can offer a variety of different perspectives. I'm going to introduce everybody now, then we'll move through presentations of 10-15 minutes odd, and then on to questions. So the first speaker will be Dr. Argita Daudze, who has worked at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Latvia from 1991 to 2020 and has been posted across Europe, but notably as ambassador to the Czech Republic between 2006 and 2010, and ambassador to Ukraine between 2011 and 2015. After leaving the diplomatic service, she worked as a foreign policy advisor to the Speaker of the Parliament of Latvia and also received her PhD in 2010. After that, we'll hear from Lukasz Kulesa, who was deputy head of the research office of the Polish Institute for International Affairs. His areas of expertise include nuclear and conventional deterrence, arms control, and NATO, and notably from 2010 to 2012, he served as deputy director of the Strategic Analysis Department at the Polish National Security Bureau. Finally, we'll hear from Dovydas Vitkauskas, who is an expert in good governance with a professional career focusing on good governance and anti-corruption. Formerly a senior case lawyer at the European Court of Human Rights, Dovydas spent the last 15 years as a team leader in various public sector projects and governance reform projects across the European Union, including 6 years in Ukraine. And I'm delighted to say you actually came, as I understand it, from Ukraine yesterday to speak at our event. So we're very grateful. There's going to be much to say. I'm not going to say very much of it at all. So we will get into questions as soon as possible, but right now I will hand over to Argita. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your kind words introducing me. I'm very delighted to be here and very pleased to see so many people in the audience. and among them also some Latvians and other Baltic friends. Though I was participating in the previous symposium of the Geopolitical Center, the Baltic Geopolitics Program in Riga last spring, and I shared my impressions as eyewitness of the revolution and its early aftermath, occupation of Crimea and Russian intervention to eastern Ukraine. Thinking about an angle how to present the Baltic view on Maidan revolution at the symposium of this year, I propose to look at a specific notion of post-Soviet space with which Ukraine as a state in public discourse has been associated for all years after collapse of Soviet Union. This unfortunate notion has been used speaking about the Baltic states too. In my opinion, in Maidan Orange Revolution of 2004, but more explicitly at the Maidan Revolution of 2014, Ukrainian society clearly expressed disagreement with the role what was designed to it by its big neighbor. Russia wanted Ukraine to be a satellite country, a post-Soviet state. Those who put together former republics of the USSR under one post-Soviet umbrella facilitated the focus at common trends in the societies of newly independent states after collapse of USSR, but for the differences of numerous societies were not played enough, but for the differences of the numerous societies were not paid enough attention. Creation of the CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States, an organization with an aim to keep former Soviet republics together, maintaining old Soviet-era links, also helped to justify the notion of post-Soviet. One can wonder, why to oppose to use the notion post-Soviet space if many citizens themselves in countries which were composing the territory of the USSR referred to this notion and admit a presence of special mindset of Homo Sovieticus in their countries and societies. During many conversations what I have had in Ukraine 10 years ago, often the issue of Soviet mentality appeared. Even young people who were on Maidan in 2014 used to refer to deep Sovietization of Ukrainians because of 70 years of Soviet communist rule. What in difference from Balts of 50 years under Soviet communist occupation was considered a main obstacle for genuine reforms and change. The difference of 20 years of communist rule, in their opinion, mattered. Of course, we do not know how the Baltic states would look like if circumstances were different, if they wouldn't not enjoy independence of 20 years between the two world wars. These 20 years of independence, what Ukraine did not have in comparison with the Baltic states, brought tremendous atrocities to Ukrainians. As a nation, they had to experience Holodomor, the great famine, deportations, collectivization, oppression of national identity, continuation of Tsarist Russification policy. That changed Ukrainian society very much. Passive conformism, what was characteristic for Soviet people and still dominates in Russian society, was present on the societal scene in Soviet Ukraine, but with certain exceptions, and mostly in the western part of the country. After the declaration of independence in 1991, Ukrainians were situating themselves in the ambiguous position, admitting that they are a post-Soviet state, but in my impression was the both. European roots and Soviet mentality cohabitated in their self-perception. The notion post-Soviet was useful for those who looked at the USSR as a mighty country with a legacy for decades and in certain degree develop nostalgia to the past times because of hard transition to democracy. Creating and using a notion of post-Soviet mentality or post-Soviet space, post-Soviet country, Russian imperialistic sentiments were and are supported. Via keeping the notion post-Soviet alive, we allow to avoid focus on failure of communist ideology and failed Soviet experiment as such. Let me share with you my impressions from one conference, which took place 2021, in the fall 2021, and I participated in that in Vienna. It was called 30 Years On, Is There Still a Post-Soviet Space? It was organized by International Peace Institute in Vienna, actually the city where I had a privilege to be a student for 9 months in the Diplomatic Academy. So I was surprised realizing that I was the only one at the workshop of the conference who considered that it is incorrect to use notion post-Soviet space, referring to countries which were once a part of the USSR. I explained why the Baltic states cannot be called post-Soviet, and one of the reasons was the de jure continuation of their statehood during the Soviet occupation. I also referred to collapse of other empires, like Austro-Hungarian one. The countries which appeared when Habsburg Empire collapsed, like Czechoslovakia, Austrian Republic or Hungary, were not called post-Habsburg. I was pleasantly surprised to hear similar argumentation used by one Austrian professor from Vienna University. His name is Philipp Thaer. In his keynote speech at the public panel of the conference, he expressed himself in a way that I feel that it is useful to quote him. And I quote, "When discussing whether or not there is truly a post-Soviet space, there are 3 key areas that should be discussed: the concept of space itself, the history of post-Soviet space, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. In debates," continuation of quotation, "in debates on European geopolitics, do we discuss a post-Habsburg space or post-Ottoman space? We do not. So why do we discuss a post-Soviet space? The term post-Soviet space is geopolitical, referring to the space of neo-imperial Russian interests. The Russian Empire was the only continental empire, European empire, to survive territory after the First World War, yet in 1991 it disintegrated without any major war. This is because 1991 signifies a Russian retreat. After the collapse, Russia lost all the territory it had conquered over the previous 300 years. Even after the Brest-Litovsk Treaty in World War I, Russia managed to hold on to many of its colonial territories. This raises the question of why Russia in 1991 accepted these territorial losses peacefully. Ukraine is the second biggest country in Europe, he continues, Professor Thaer. Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova represent a split in the post-Soviet space, such that it could be said the post-Soviet space no longer exists. The region is now marked by a fight for geopolitical hegemony between the West and Russia. The conflict in Ukraine, and he spoke in October 2021, the conflict in Ukraine should not be seen as domestic Ukrainian conflict, but as a Ukraine-Russia conflict. Ukraine is a democracy in the making, with clear Western ambitions, while Russia is trying to rebuild an empire on ethnic nationalism. End of the quote. So, in my mind, Professor Thayer gives accurate characteristics on the situation in Europe. Russia's current aggression against an independent neighboring country in 21st century reflects neo-imperial mindset of their leaders and society. It also brings to the surface the past of Ukraine's very difficult relations with Russia through centuries. Horrors, what the nation had to go through during the 20th century, sufferings caused by Russian Bolsheviks and communist regime. Ukrainian struggle against Russia is a struggle against international lawbreakers. It is a battle of two civilizations, in my opinion. The courage to oppose Russian interference in Ukrainian affairs in the 21st century first was demonstrated in the Maidan Revolution of Dignity. Let me remind you about the beginning of the Ukrainian Revolution. The Revolution of Dignity, called Euromaidan. I remember very well the evening when it started, November 21, 2013. Latvian Embassy organized a National Day reception at the building of the State Philharmonic on European Square in Kiev. Ukrainian Foreign Ministry officials joined us late and in a very bad mood. The reason was announcement by Prime Minister Azarov regarding the decision not to sign association agreement with European Union. Big part of Ukrainians critical to the President Yanukovych and his government went very angry, and this angriness was reflected in spontaneous gatherings of students in the Maidan Square close to Stela of Liberty on the late evening of November 21. It was a beginning. The continuation and the real gatherings of protesters in the Square of Independence, Maidan Nezalezhnosti, and building barricades started after militia used brutal force against students. Demonstrations gathered people from all over the Ukraine, demanding the government to get back on European path. Ukrainian society in 2013 was living in certain hopes that closer ties with European Union will bring more order and faster economic development in Ukraine. Many started to believe in the possibility of changes. Dominating narrative in media and political debates more and more turned towards gains in long run than short-term losses for Ukraine if it chooses European path. It seemed that notion of Europe started to become an answer to many problems that Ukrainian decision makers were facing and became a synonym of good life for common people. As historian Sergei Plokhy puts it in his famous history book, The Gates of Europe, in some cases the fascination with European West was turning into a new national religion. When 10 countries in Europe entered European Union in 2004, it gave certain push to Ukrainian elites to took at European direction more than before, admitting that multi-vectoral foreign policy has not brought fruits as they expected. Corrupt ministers and other public servants, private bankers and businessmen in general had to make a choice to start serious structural reforms and develop independently from Russia's economy and state, or become a part of Russian space. For a very long time, Ukraine was viewed in the West as a satellite of Russia and looked at through so to say, spectacles of Russia. For instance, events in Ukraine in foreign media were presented by correspondents in Moscow, not directly from Kiev. Now, with the full-scale war on the Ukrainian soil, world media reports directly from battlefields and Ukrainian cities under attack of Russian missiles and drones. European Union and the West in general had to admit that goals set by Maidan Revolution were sincere. it was a message also from the Baltic diplomats to their partners. Ukrainians have chosen their vector of development with European Union, and they are serious about that. 3 months of street clashes and intensive political work to prevent bloodshed as much as possible ended with the president and government fleeing to Russia and democratic forces taking responsibility for the country. As EU ambassador at that time, Jan Tombinsky concluded, since the memorable Autumn of Nations in 1989, this was the biggest victory of the people over an authoritarian regime in Europe. Maidan society showed a commitment to become a different society. I wonder if I have more to... Yeah, thank you. In the beginning of 90s, a big friend of the Baltic people, Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, used an expression of the Baltic litmus test, speaking about Russia's ability to act democratically and accept their choice to integrate into the West. He also used this expression of litmus test about willingness and ability of nations of European Union to accept Baltic states in European Union and to take steps necessary to contribute to the stability in northwestern Europe. And now, the litmus test analogy can be used to Ukraine. I will quote expression of Ambassador to Ukraine, Jan Tombinsky again. The future of Ukraine rose to the rank of a litmus test of the global order. Maidan Revolution of 2014 was kind of litmus test for Ukrainian society's democratic resistance potential to Russian pressure. But neither them or European Union countries were prepared to face Russian military aggression, and not in a scale what we are experiencing now. The Baltic states had a skin-touch contact with the aggressive neighbor Russia in the form of Soviet Union at the end of 30s and occupation in 1940, and repeated occupation in 1945, which lasted until 1991. Baltic political leaders of that time tried to adapt to circumstances, 1940, decided not to fight, pretending to believe the promises of Soviet leaders not to touch the sovereignty of their states. In a situation of the World War, it was impossible to expect help from other countries, and we lost our freedom. We cannot draw direct parallels between the Baltic occupation and Ukraine in 2014, but certainly we could project that Russia will not stop in Crimea. We could project that. When two ambassadors of EU countries in Ukraine, Lithuanian Petras Vaitiekūnas and me, visited Crimea in the beginning of March 2014, when so-called green men started to occupy Crimean territory, it was no secret anymore where they came from. Crimea was incorporated into Russia after a staged referendum which ignored Ukrainian constitution and the international law. The main message from the EU to Ukraine was not to use arms in resistance to Russians. In decision-making circles of Russia, it was perceived as a weakness of the West. The weakness encouraged Russia to conduct the war, and it was used further for aggressive behavior. How the Baltic politicians reacted?
Only a little more time. Only a little more time.
Thank you. How the Baltic politicians reacted? Urged NATO allies to demonstrate strength on the territory of the alliance close to Russia's border. The Baltic states and Poland received military support, NATO forward presence battle groups. Only strength and good preparation for possible warfare can deter the neighbor will live side by side. Ukraine's decision to fight aggressor in 2014, who occupied part of Ukraine, was the only possible one. Negotiations with Russian leadership could not lead to anywhere, as we see it now in retrospective. If a very simple answer would be requested to the question, what went wrong? Why situation escalated to the open military conflict and invasion? My answer would be simple. Clash of two different mindsets of peoples belonging to different historical time zones. Russian leaders live in the past. Ukrainians are striving for the future. The past, Russia tries to ruin the future of the other, of Ukraine. One of them is post-Soviet country Russia. The civic society of the other, Ukraine, in 2014 has demonstrated at Euromaidan Revolution of Dignity that post-Soviet paradigm is over for Ukraine, and I think forever. Glory to Ukraine.
Thank you so much. I'll just ask Lukasz to come up now.
First and foremost, thank you very much for the invitation. Poland is a country that was alternatively trying to embrace or reject its Baltic credentials. Sometimes it presented itself very much as a part of the Baltic states. Sometimes it was running away to become a country of Central Europe. I have a feeling that we are re-embracing right now our Baltic identity, and that might be part of it. Of course, it's very hard act to follow from Ms. Ambassador. I will present a more think tank / analytical approach to the question of what were the drivers and what were the deliverables of the Polish foreign and security policy with regards to Ukraine, with the center of the events of 2013 and 2014. And I think it's very important not to view these events through the prism of 2022 and 2024, where a lot of what we think we remember or what the narratives we are creating about the past are being shaped by the brutality and viciousness of Russian full-scale aggression. Interestingly, in case of Poland, some of the actors, political actors that were present and active in that time are back at power positions again, including Prime Minister Tusk and Minister of Foreign Affairs Radosław Sikorski. So it might also be interesting to compare the policy then with the policy right now. But the starting point, also acknowledging the place I'm in, the starting point for me would be looking at the concepts that basically underwritten the Polish policy towards Ukraine since the 1990s and even before, because the starting point are very much the concepts which were formulated by the Polish emigre society, the group especially centered around the Kultura magazine, Jerzy Giedroyć, Julian Mieroszewski, and these very much became the roadmap for the Polish Eastern policy after the war. Some of these ideas, renunciation of any territorial claims towards our eastern neighbors, which may seem obvious right now, it wasn't so in the 1950s to those of the Poles who had to escape the communist regime and also escape from the areas which were then known as Kresy Wschodnie, the eastern part of Poland. Support for establishment, normalization, and cooperation in relations with Ukraine, with Belarus, also re-establishment of the relationship with Lithuania, influenced by common heritage, but based on equality, also something which was pretty novel for the Polish political tradition. With regards to Ukraine, the direct link between the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine and independence, sovereignty, and security of Poland. Here is the quote that I think can be traced down to Marshal Piłsudski: there can be no independent Poland without an independent Ukraine. So in a sense, imperative of partnership. And also the idea that Polish standing with our Western partners would be very much influenced by the Polish standing in the East and our relations with the Eastern partners. So these were the ideas that were taken over in the 1990s and created the basis for the conduct of the Polish Eastern policy. But I would claim that they were sometimes interpreted in a different way. So the starting point was the same. The next steps were slightly different. I would here distinguish between something which may be called a romantic approach, which towards Ukraine, which would basically state that this is mainly the Polish responsibility towards good Polish-Ukrainian relation. That support for Ukraine should be with little or no conditionality, that there should be strategic patience with regards to a number of issues, including the common history, the controversial issue with the common history, and the ideal should be the brotherly relations, unlocking the potential of the bilateral partnership. So the romantic approach, also sometimes contrasting with it, very much a pragmatic approach, which would summon that it is a common responsibility to maintain the good relationship. There should be honesty and openness with regards to challenging questions and issues also connected with the Polish history, and that the support for Ukraine should be qualified and somehow conditional also on the behavior of the Ukrainian side. I may also try to distinguish the extreme pragmatism, which very much said that the support of Poland towards Ukraine should be very much conditional and based only on the fulfillment of by Ukraine of some of the Polish expectations, especially regarding the Second World War history, the massacres in Volhynia and Eastern Galicia. And these various strains very much contributed to the creation of the Polish Eastern policy towards Ukraine. And by early, doing a fast forward, by early 2013, very much the pragmatic approach was the dominant one, and the overall importance of the relationship with Ukraine lost their importance. And here I think it's crucial to look at the literature from that period, not the literature that was already and is already shaped by the next decade in the Polish-Ukrainian cooperations. Because the early expectations that President Yanukovych would see the benefits of the closer relationship with Ukraine, epitomized by the association agreement and the DCFTA, but also that he would understand that it would require internal reforms in Ukraine, these were very much seen as misguided and mistaken. And on the Polish side, there was actually an attempt to also conduct personal diplomacy between President Komorowski and President Yanukovych. As part of the team of the National Security Bureau, I was very much in the back row, but also part of some of these discussions, which were extremely frustrating and extremely futile. Basically, the bet, if there was a bet on Yanukovych and his team, was already seen as misguided. There was also a conviction that the Polish efforts to engage Ukrainian leadership find a way out on things like the Tymoshenko case, or to finalize the work on the association agreement and the DCFTA, that these were very much treated by Yanukovych as a sign of weakness, and that he was trying very much in a cynical way to maneuver between the EU the Russian carrot and stick approach at that time, and also his own elites, including business elites and his own society. So according to one expert summary from 2012, the dominant mood in Warsaw was one, and here I quote, disappointment and wariness with this partner, the disbelief in the ability of Ukraine elites to understand the requirements related to the modernization of the state. And here, the events of November 2013 were very much seen as the effect of the mobilization of the Ukrainian society, rejection of the post-Soviet space label of kind of in-between model. Not just Yanukovych maneuvering, but also the broader state of the Ukrainian country and society and business relations that he epitomized. And of course, that very much provided a boost to this romantic part of the Polish approach to Ukraine. You had massive media coverage, presence of journalists, presence of observers, volunteers supporting the protests, broad support in the Polish society, visits to Maidan by prominent politicians, including Jarosław Kaczyński, who was then the leader of the oppositional Law and Justice, and clear parallel being made between Maidan and some of the glorious cases from the Polish history where the public protests led to political change, such as the 1980 strikes. Some concerns, yes, some concerns over the presence of ultra-nationalist forces in Maidan, of the symbolism using the image of Stepan Bandera and some of the symbols of OUN and UPA, but mostly explained as a necessary element of the revolutionary situation in which Ukraine was. At the level of the government, I would say a clear preference for the pro-EU forces to prevail, but at the same time, concern and cautious about the stability of Ukraine, about the scenario of a prolonged chaos and this dismantlement of state structure. Also worry that turned out to be justified about the potential reaction of Russia. Even before February of next year, Poland offered mediation efforts. These were initially rejected. There was also, I understand, a very furious diplomacy behind the scenes by everyone concerned. By the way, this Polish position was very much viciously criticized inside the country. The position was seen as too timid, too cautious with regards to the revolution that was taking place in Ukraine. Then we had the famous mission of the three ministers of the Weimar countries that, at least in the Polish narrative, is spearheaded by the efforts of Minister Sikorski, but very much also coordinated with the EU structures and with Baroness Ashton personally. And the agreement that was brokered by the presence of, with the involvement of the ministers, that right now seems to be either forgotten or seen as part of this big conspiracy of a regime change in Ukraine, the agreement of February 21. But at the time of the adoption, it seemed that, at least when you read to the accounts from the Polish side, from Minister Sikorski personally, for some of the people who accompanied him in Kiev, that it was seen as the best way to stop the killing, as the best way to agree a transfer of power that would be manageable. So the warning by Sikorski, which was caught on the camera, that either the opposition signs this agreement or, and I quote, you will have martial law, you will have the army, and you will all be dead. That reflected the high emotions of the moment, but also the assessment of the situation and his assessment of the determination of Yanukovych to stay in power. Now we know that that was not the case. The determination of Yanukovych was gone, and the structures of power at that point already started to crumble. So at the same time, of course, the Polish leadership was not unhappy to see Yanukovych gone, offered its full support to the new government at the bilateral level, internationally. And of course, that only increased after Russia moved its troops first to occupy Crimea and then to support and reinforce pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. That was seen as the realization of a nightmare scenario that was already discussed in the Polish strategic community of Russia using this opportunity and the weakness of Ukraine to move in. Interestingly, and these are the final points, Russia was involved in early stages of the discussion. Poland was involved in an early stage of discussions on the diplomatic track, including directly with Russia. There was now an almost forgotten meeting between Lavrov, Steinmeier, and Sikorski in St. Petersburg in June of 2014. But I may say that its principal stance was very much out of sync and increasingly out of sync with the positions of Germany, France, Russia, and Ukraine. And Ukraine itself, it was often written in the Polish sources, decided to rely on the diplomatic powers of Western European countries to reach an understanding with Russia, and basically made no attempts to bring Poland into the negotiations. Poland wanted to insert itself in these various formats of negotiations, be them Normandy and later Minsk, but that was very much rebuffed by all the parties, including Ukraine. Poland was not part of the Normandy format meeting, Minsk negotiations, which of course gave the Polish politicians and the Polish experts this very nice political and moral high ground to criticize the directions of the negotiations and the directions of the Minsk agreements, for example, but also reduced very much Polish impact on the situation. So looking again through some of the commentaries and analysis from the second part of the 2014, it is clear to me that the idea was that ultimately it was a lost opportunity for Poland, that it supported, provided this support to Ukraine at the high point of the crisis, but then basically either was sidelined or sidelined itself partly from the diplomatic part of the process. And let me finish here. I'll be happy to answer any questions which you may have.
I think everyone can agree that those are two absolutely fascinating presentations, both of which actually have a strong sense of history to them, which I think is really interesting that we're coming back to that so strongly in this first panel. Both raise the issue of Ukrainian structural reforms and Ukrainian governance reforms, and that would seem a perfect moment to turn to Dovydas and his own remarks before we get into questions.
Hi, my name is Dovydas Vitkauskas. I'm going to talk to you today about good governance and anti-corruption in Ukraine, 10 years since Maidan. What have you achieved and what we have missed as opportunities? I will be talking as a Lithuanian, to give you a Lithuanian perspective, a Baltic perspective, also as a consultant who has worked for various donors, including European Union, but also someone who has worked for Ukrainian government as an advisor. Last time I checked, I was still on the official list of Zelensky's few foreign advisors, advising also on the same issues as good governance, public sector reform, etc. So I'm trying to combine these perspectives to give you a view of what has happened since 2014 and where do we go from here. So sorry for this rather concentrated sort of havoc of various elements, but I will try to very, very shortly in one slide to outline the reform vision in 2014, the way I see it, and also fast forward to 2024, 10 years later. The vision, in terms of who's responsible for it, we could say that this was both the Ukrainian government, both administrations of Petro Poroshenko and Vladimir Zelensky, but also donors and so-called external partners working together with the Ukrainian government. There were very few disputes about the vision at the time in 2014, and I think we knew what needed to be done, but of course there was some disagreements on how to proceed, and I think I will try to cover some of these issues as we go. One of the main directions was, let's create more institutions for checks and balances, and that included in my sector the one that I know best, which is the rule of law, legal, law enforcement, power structures of the state. That included a lot of new structures that were created. If we talk about today, Ukraine has 11 last time I counted, and we need to check with various lawyers to have the exact number, maybe even more institutions that have the power to collect evidence, criminal evidence that can be used in court. You have 5 institutions that can actually bring charges and formulate them through prosecution, but you have more than 10 who can actually record, surveil, and actually, make your life a living hell if they want to. So let's say from the quantitative perspective, we did a good job. There are many institutions working in this area. The same with people. The overall philosophy starting from 2014 was, let's get new people in. And new people didn't mean like fresh blood, like students out of the university. It meant basically that let's have a transparent selection processes, sort of academic style selection processes where we test people's ability, capacity, skills. We do psychological testing, interviews, and many other things that private organizations are doing in public sector. This way, I personally participated overseeing and paying for a lot of, as a team leader of a big EU project, for the selection of 150 judges of the new Supreme Court of Ukraine. In case you ask why they need 150 judges, UK just have 12. We can have a separate discussion over coffee. But again, from the quantitative perspective, we did fine. We selected these people. We had a rather transparent processes. There was overwhelming feeling that these selection processes were of rather good quality. Transparency as an overall objective was, again, an agreed direction, and one of the best examples of policies to promote transparency was so-called declaration of assets and income, which we in Lithuania and in many states in the Baltic and in Northern Europe have had for decades, actually. In Lithuania, we've had it since 1996, if I'm not wrong. In some Western European countries, you still don't have it. So in a way, it's a good example that Ukraine actually was not even applying a European standard, but sort of was applying in itself setting a new standard and following a few countries of the European Union who had this sort of policy, this sort of practice. And that brought about also a sensible change in the way the public sector officials, but also other public persons, including people related to politicians, etc., had to declare their income and assets. Tendering processes was one of the, I would say, agreed directions. It was agreed that tenders need to be conducted for all public procurement. As of today, Ukraine has more than 40 online marketplaces in one of a platform called Prozoro, which allows to buy and sell property online, including and not only limited public procurement from the state. And this, of course, also brought a lot of positive aspects to the way the economic resources are redistributed. E-government in general, I would underline as one of the biggest achievements over the last 10 years. Ukraine has focused a lot on what we can call a back office, which is the quality of data that the government collects, the quality of registers, the interaction between various registers. Then, since Zelensky took over, he continued what Poroshenko had started, and since 2019 created, probably you've heard of it, the online available app, a phone app called DIA. And DIA clearly is one of the best practices of a good front office for eGov. Of course, there's still a lot of work to be done, but Ukraine in this respect, again, is not following a best European practice. It is setting a better practice than many other European countries have. Banking system, maybe this has been somewhat overlooked by analysts, but also as someone who works in rule of law, I see an absolutely clear, direct causal link between the way the society operates and the way the rule of law system operates and the good operation of the banking system. And you might know that Ukraine had more than 200 banks at the time of second Maidan in 2014. Now we move fast forward to 2024. Ukraine has less than 70 banks. It still has too many, if you ask me, for the country of this size and for the economy of this size. But it is a good example that there's a great cleaning up job was done. And by the way, most of it, the bulk of it, was done under Poroshenko administration by the then president of National Bank, Gontarev, and this is clearly has brought very good results. And in fact, last year, Ukrainian banks had record profits. Don't ask me how a country in the time of war can do that. We can also discuss that over coffee. But this attests to the health, relative health, and from various perspectives of the banking system. And clearly, this is one of the biggest achievements of Maidan. Credit is still not purely accessible to people in business. It has to be said. It is still expensive. However, the banking system is much healthier than it was, and it is relatively healthy even by regional standards. Of course, it helps that Ukraine has 5 commercial banks that are state-owned. How did that happen? We can also talk over coffee. You have probably heard one of these stories. It was a famous private bank which was nationalized along the way with the first stage of after the first stage of reforms in 2015 and 2016. There was almost $5 billion of taxpayer money that was borrowed from international partners to pay for that nationalization. At the end of the day, I think it's a mixed bag, but it definitely cannot be said that private bank nationalization failed. I think, as an overall perspective, it added to this health of the banking system that we're talking about today. Now, what hasn't happened, despite the overwhelming agreement that it has to be done in 2014? First thing that I would note, and it's an overall direction, it's competition in politics. Competition that you have in democracy is all the new by way of party system, by way of public scrutiny of all appointment decisions, by way of accountability that works not just once in 4 years or 5 years at the election cycle, but that works every day between the election cycles. Then where the scrutiny through bipartisan politics or coalition politics, it doesn't matter, but competition is essential to have a healthy political system. So I think one thing where we can say still relatively firmly where Ukraine has not achieved the objectives that we hoped for is competition in politics. You still have parties that are created every 5 years as a sort of a project by one or the other individual to try to put some people together. Some of these people are coming from the previous governments and previous regimes, etc. And that's exactly what happened in 2019 when Zelensky, over this overwhelming support for him personally as a leader, created the party Sluga Narodu that won the elections outright with absolute majority of seats. That never happened in Ukrainian politics before. Now, of course, fast forward to 2024, Sluga Narodu has very poor ratings. In fact, if you look at how Zelensky is, in fact, dealing with the party, he's trying to distance himself from it. And I think in some ways you could say that it is a reasonable and pragmatic thing to do, because even from the point of view of amount of criminal investigations, I believe last time I checked, there were more than 30 members of parliament from Sluga Narodu who were under criminal investigation of some sort. So clearly, the party system, the multi-party system that we are talking about in the West still hasn't worked in Ukraine, and I think we still need to give countries some time in order to develop a proper competition and proper party politics. Lustration, something which probably for a British audience sounds like a weird word, but something with which we are familiar, especially in the Baltics, talking a Baltic perspective, and Poland, and many countries with ex-communist past, was a policy tool through which people who collaborated with the previous regime, in our case it was mostly communist regimes, were not allowed to take up high government positions. In some cases, like in Latvia, for instance, even run as elected officials for parliament. So this sort of tool was applied, or at least attempted to be applied, by Poroshenko administration in 2014, was totally walked down by Zelensky administration in 2019. Again, we can talk over coffee. Why did this happen? But lustration in terms of accountability, personal accountability for collaborating either with the Soviets or with Yanukovych in the past, didn't fly at the end of the day. Market economy, I think this is where Ukraine still lags behind. Ukraine has amazing potential in terms of innovation and business and entrepreneurship and the spirit of business generally. However, the state has always kept a very tight grip over how economic resource is redistributed. And that happens through various forms. Take, for instance, the amount of state-owned enterprises. Centrally owned, still more than 3,000. If we count all municipal enterprises, it's close to 20,000. These are numbers that are nowhere near, let's say, OECD best practice standards. These are numbers closer to China and countries that have excessive role of government in the economy. And I'm always saying, as a governance expert, when the state doesn't know how to do its core business, which is regulate, then it does business. And of course, in most cases, fails. So this can still be said about Ukraine, and of course Zelensky's administration now, especially because of the wartime, is putting for sale quite a lot of these SOEs. I'm afraid, however, and quite sort of cautiously, but not optimistic, but I would say rather pessimistic about any chances of success, because in bankruptcy and in general, in getting rid of assets, time is money. The more time you lose, the less your asset has value. And of course, Ukraine has lost 3 decades in many cases of selling these companies. A good example could be many of the companies that probably in the late 80s and early 90s could have been sold and privatized if done properly for a very big, let's say, value, now are worthless. We're talking about especially military industry. We're talking about high-tech industry that was high-tech in the 80s and 90s, but is no longer high-tech. And of course, the longer the government waited, the less value you could squeeze. And I'm afraid that this process of privatization will be painful. Many people will lose jobs. It will be inevitable, but will not bring much benefit to the budget. And I think this I still put as something that hasn't happened, hasn't been achieved, and definitely something that still needs to be done. Competition in business. I mentioned competition in politics as an absolute prerequisite for having a well-functioning society. Competition in business, also a mixed bag, if we have to assess Ukraine today. Many of poor policy decisions from the 90s are still haunting, and especially in cases like electricity market, where private monopolies were basically created by very hasty privatization decisions. Things like that happen not only in Ukraine, but Ukraine is an example. And I think to walk back this unfair privatization and to create more environment for new players to come up in every business sector is one of the prerequisites for a well-functioning society. I do hope that Zelensky's administration puts the money where its mouth is and actually does that by creating more oversight over monopoly practices, over cartels, and trying to, in some cases, probably walk back some very, very poorly done policies from the 90s where private monopolies were created in some areas. Privatization of land, this will be probably my main point to complete the presentation of achievements. You might be surprised, but Ukraine only opened the land market in 2021, and even that by very small steps. Foreigners still cannot own land. Since 1st of January, legal persons can be entitled to owning land, and in fact, it's a very difficult process for notaries, for technical aspects in order to have fully formalized, let's say, land titles. This is something that definitely shows that Ukraine was still holding back or looking back to its Soviet heritage by way of creating ability to use land, to lease it, to sublet it, but not really own it, not really formalize it as a title in the register, not something that can be used as a collateral to monetize and get a loan in the bank, etc. So this has not been done. The process started in 2021 after a big push by World Bank and other international partners. Let's hope this process takes traction, because this is absolutely essential. In my opinion, it's a DNA for a market economy to have proper land. The same with housing. If you live in Odessa or Kiev or one of these big cities in one of these huge 25-story private apartment blocks, it's probably weird, but every month together with your communal charges and utility bills, you get a land fee, which you still pay. So actually land is really not private under those buildings. And land is, in many cases, is owned by state and given by way of very murky processes as a lease to private developers who are transferring this, let's say, hassle to the buyers of flats. So also dealing with question of building land would be essential to again, put the buildings where they are in reality, on land. For the time being, they're hanging in the air, we could say. So many structural things. Let me share a few stories with you. NABU is a specialized investigative body that was created as part of this big process of new institutions that we all participated in since 2015. And it has done quite a lot of impressive work in a way, you could say, in terms of process. For instance, there was president of Supreme Court, Vsevolod Knyazev, who was caught with a 2.7 million in cash. And well, the alleged origin of that cash was one of the other famous Ukrainian businessmen and banking system representative from the old days, from the Yanukovych era, former member of parliament, who had been accused of embezzling money in amounts of billions, leading to bankruptcy of those financial institutions. So it's an example of the staggering amount of just one alleged bribe, which NABU investigated. The story dates to May last year. There's an older story, but there's a more impressive amount of just one bribe for one particular businessman, which was allegedly taken by the head of the tax authority, Roman Nasirov. That happened before the Zelensky administration. The investigation is still ongoing, and actually it's not clear where it will lead, but clearly, as we say in our business, there's no smoke without fire. There's this sort of standard of proof that sometimes is also important, and hundreds of millions of alleged damage in cases of dealing with Odessa by so-called Odessa beneficiaries, Kaufman and Granovsky. This is where I probably need to give a short explanation of what the word beneficiary means in the Ukrainian, let's say, day-to-day lingo. Definitely not something to do with equity and trusts in English law or you know, in AML, know your client applications that the banks are collecting. The word beneficiary in the Ukrainian society still means it's some sort of like overlord who doesn't have the accountability of the government, but whom everybody knows in the certain region or certain city, the city officials are consulting with and probably doing some deals in terms of, for instance, redistribute land, give land on lease for private development, etc. So Kaufman and Granovsky are well-known beneficiaries of Odessa, sort of like feudal overlords who survived even Soviet times. And again, don't ask me how did that happen. They're not blue-blooded. I don't believe they are. But this sort of system, this sort of semi-feudal approach to governance, not having accountability or even formal office, but still getting piece of the pie, still exists in Ukraine today. And again, clearly, NABU is trying to do something about it. Everyone's trying to do something about it, but this is still somewhere where we still have more work to do. A few other cases, also former president of central bank, Kirill Shevchenko, was accused of embezzling 50 million from his former employer. This story I put forward because many other stories are like that with criminal investigations. It's also a good example that of lack of proper competition in politics, because when Shevchenko was put up for the new president of National Bank, I believe in 2020, that was around the time of COVID, no one in the government, no one in Zelensky's administration discussed about these sort of skeletons in his closet by way of these previous dealings in Ukrgazbank. This only came up later when Shevchenko became politically, let's say, inconvenient. And then with his dismissal came the criminal case. I think I'm trying to show you the mechanics, how sometimes in Ukraine, because of lack of political accountability, because of lack of discussion at the time in 2020 about these possibly criminal dealings. Maybe the appointment would not have happened. And maybe if there was proper opposition party putting these arguments properly, maybe the appointment would have wouldn't have succeeded. In Ukraine, somehow, these appointments are still being done without much political scrutiny, and usually when the person becomes no longer relevant for various reasons, then of course, in addition to dismissal, you get a small bonus by way of a NABU investigation or something like that. Sometimes without even pulling the strings, it's just things come up. You know, as many people have some issues in the past. But my point is having good competition in political system would have prevented that and would have prevented this sort of mix of political accountability together with law enforcement and criminal prosecutions. I will, because how much time we have?
Running out.
Okay, I will skip straight to my last points. Where do we go from here? I think one of the lessons to be learned, and by the way, I'm talking not only about Ukraine, I'm talking about most of the countries I've worked in. I'm definitely talking about mine for sure, including new and old democracies. Where do we go from here to really put more accountability and efficiency into the word democracy? I think we have democracy, enough of it, but efficiency and accountability is still a big task. And as a result, democracy, I think, runs a big risk of maybe not losing, but let's say giving away some of the positions of being the most economically efficient model. I think we all believe and we all see that it now is an uphill struggle for democracies to prove that they're still economically efficient. I think my arguments here and my points I'm making here are essential for us to rethink, and it clearly applies to Ukraine, but also to many of our societies, and I think it applies also to donors who are advising Ukraine and are still doing it by way of inertia rather than more creative thinking. Law is like money. I think the more you print it, the less you have it. So I think this is something we need to learn, again, this lesson, and really be more economic about creating new pieces of legislation. That applies to Ukraine as well. The parliament is overproducing legislation that, again, ends up in a mixed bag of contradictory rules. Corruption is an economic phenomenon, not a moral one. And incentives for corruption are more important if you want to change the system. Punishing corruption by way of criminal tools is really just a very small percentage of work that needs to be done. Unfortunately, we are over-focused on criminal tools at the expense of those that can disincentivize corruption. System versus people. The myth of a big salary, for instance. Knyazov, the guy who allegedly took 2.7 million bribe, he was being paid a very fair salary, I think probably bigger than a UK Supreme Court judge, up to almost $20,000 per month with all the bonuses. But you know, it didn't prevent him from this temptation to succumb to 2.7 million. So big salary is a myth. If the system incentivizes corruption, people will do it, even the best of people. And it is more important to work on the system to disincentivize corruption, to incentivize more appropriate behavior, rather than focus on selecting new people. I think we still have a lot of inertia in this respect. We still believe that, oh yeah, let's get new ones again, and then those new ones will start behaving the old way. Chances are, and we've seen it in Ukraine, we've seen it in other countries, so I think this is very important to remember that. And my last point, I will stop here, will be on privatization of land, because privatization of land gives better collateral, it gives cheaper credit, it gives more accountable business, it gives business that starts thinking about reputation, and in a way, it solves many problems with the rule of law. So I'm trying just to create these sort of causal links where we sometimes don't see them, that there's absolutely direct link between healthy, accessible credit, a healthy banking system with accessible credit and the rule of law. So thank you. Sorry for taking your time.
That was absolutely terrific. I should say, if you'd be prepared to make those slides available to the audience, I suspect many would like to go through them in more detail, because that was fantastic. Okay, I'm not going to take up very much time. There is a microphone just here. Kathy is going to run it around. I'm going to show my technical brilliance by pressing a button to turn it on. There we go. All right, questions? Brennan, right at the front.
Thank you very much.
If that was the wrong button, this is the most humiliating moment of my academic
So
career.
thank you very
all know
much.
that.
Three really interesting presentations. My question is actually for the
Are we there?
ambassador. It was on the point you made about the
Okay.
EU advising Ukraine not to contest militarily the occupation and annexation of Crimea. Can you say a little bit more about how that was articulated and what the thinking behind that policy was?
You can just speak into the microphone, it's all right. It's just there.
I think Lady Ashton would be the one who can answer this question better than me. And I'm very pleased to see Lady Ashton here. It's was great meetings in Kiev at that time, 2014, 2015. So I can share with you the impressions what I had together with the Lithuanian ambassador Pietras Vaitiekūnas when we were in Crimea, and here in this booklet what was done in Kiev 2015 with different our impressions from our visit to Crimea, also some impressions from Latvia. Yeah? That when, especially when we met with a public, so the public gathering in Bakhchisarai, that's the so-called capital of Crimean Tatars, and they asked us, what you will do, European Union countries, when the Russian planes will flying over Ukraine and dropping bombs, what you will do? And you know, it was extremely hard to get this question, because we knew that European Union will do anything, because European Union is not a defense alliance. It is a NATO who can think in these terms. So European Union is soft power. So I am not answering your question, I know, but consciously I don't do that, sorry.
Fair enough. Yes, just there.
I'm just conscious of time, so sharp questions.
Thank you very much. My name is Mati Malikov. I'm now at the European External Action Service, and by way of full disclosure, I've said our paths have crossed with Dovydas when I was the EU ambassador to Ukraine, 2019-2023. I'd like to a bit challenge Dovydas, your notion about the political competition not being there in Ukraine. You're right that new parties are called emerge all. And I pretty much would put that to the basket of Ukrainians' sincere, passionate belief in democracy. Every time at the elections they go to the polls, electing somebody new, wanting somebody new, really believing that this time around we get lucky. At the same time, Tymoshenko's party is there since 1990s. It does exist, it is in the parliament, and it will not be. Poroshenko's party as well. Zelensky, before the full-scale war started, remained throughout his first 3 years as president, remained the most popular by far presidential candidate. He was at 30% in the first round in 2019. His ratings never dropped under 20. I would argue that some elements of healthy political competition, stability even, are there in Ukraine as well.
Yeah, the idea, agreed, Marty, that it's a question of degree and intensity of this competition that we want, right? We're still not there in terms of full degree, and I put an example where, for instance, someone becomes politically inconvenient, and that happens in any system. What happens in Ukraine, that then all the old skeletons from the closet are being dug up. That should happen before a person is appointed. That should happen in parliament and discussions, and you know what I'm talking about. It's not just about Kyrylo Shevchenko, the former president of the National Bank. Many other appointments are being squeezed hastily like that, and when something goes wrong, the person goes out through the door, and of course you have all the criminal cases then emerging. And then the question is, why shouldn't we deal with that preventively? And I think good degree and intensity of political competition would help there.
Can I add to that? One, I would be careful about saying that there is a stable Western model of political parties. And, just, picking up a non-Baltic France and the way that President Macron basically demolished the political parties in France, and now we would probably need to live with the consequences. So the idea that there is a model and the Ukraine doesn't stick to it, I would question that. Then the second issue is, on the one hand, the freezing of the political processes in terms of elections in Ukraine, but on the other hand, a very intensive unfreeze, which you can probably see, especially in the last months, that would create new movements and new initiatives, new projects also. And you might have probably an interesting mix of the old and the new, who could basically entice some of the people from the volunteer groups, from the civil society, who would entice some former military veterans, including high-ranking, to participate in the political process. These are all very much questions which are there in the open, but at least also for me, it's not something completely unusual, and it's actually understandable under the current circumstances in Ukraine.
Ambassador, would you like to come in on that? Other questions? Yes.
Thanks, Hugo. James Oates from the Centre of Geopolitics, I guess. I thought the comment about post-Soviet space was quite interesting, because what you're saying, I think, Ambassador, is that we are using the post-Soviet name as a provisional kind of identity, because the fact is that as far as Russia is concerned, the independence and democracy of Eastern and Central European states are provisional, and I think that's what we have seen very much in Ukraine. I was interested also, though, to see that we talked about the European Union from a security context, which it doesn't really have. We haven't talked about the acquis communautaire and what that might do from the point of view of economic development. I guess we need to transition from post-Soviet to somehow pre-European.
Maybe one more, just because I'm conscious of time. So there was a question there. Yes, if we just take those two together, somewhere. Yes, you sir.
Hello, Dovydas Vitkauskas, news agency Alta, Lithuania. I want to give maybe two broad questions to Polish colleague, Mr. Lukasz. I remember vividly the moment, just several months after the full-scale Russian invasion, I was visiting one of the main refugee center in Lublin, and taking interview with the head of that center, local priest, of course, local Catholic priest, and in this interview he said, now this is a real tectonic shift between us, what we see, between Poland and Ukraine, on the very down-to-earth societal level. Now things are really changing. Everything what were bad, all the things, all this historical legacy, now is going to the past and everything else. Now we see a lot of things. Which put this notion of this priest under the doubt. What is your vision? What is your take? Thank you.
Can we go to the ambassador and others first on James Oates' question, and then we'll come to this.
Just thank you for looking at the post-Soviet as a label. it was rightly mentioned by Paul, legal label, yeah, from your side as a relevant one. And I think whether to call countries who escaped or from Soviet Union as pre-European, I would wonder if I would like to call them like this. But why not to use newly independent? It was used, yeah, but somehow this post-Soviet label took over, both in the political narrative and also in the academia, unfortunately.
Partly combining two questions, also segueing into the Poland and the blocking and the protest question that you probably referred to, right, Vito? So I think it is very important to keep this feeling of perspective in Ukraine, that it will become European, that it will become member. However, we also have to distinguish two things, and unfortunately we're mixing them sometimes. That's where negotiations are for. Negotiations are there and they will continue. I mean, if we look at the practice, and some other countries have been continuing negotiations, in some cases for decades. So we don't wish that for Ukraine, but it is important to distinguish the negotiations question, which should go on for sure and should have progresses recorded by stages, from the question of enlargement. Enlargement is purely political question that will not be decided by the successive negotiations. We understand that, and that's where the Polish protests come in. EU and capitals, all our capitals in Vilnius and Brussels and Warsaw for sure, have to take note of what Polish farmers, but it's not just Polish farmers, also truckers and some other interest groups are saying. And they need to listen, and they need to bring these questions back to Brussels, and also EU has to reform. Not only Ukraine has to reform, to be taken, EU has to reform. And these will be very difficult questions to be tackled, including, but not limited to, agricultural policy.
Just very briefly, because we can spend another half an hour discussing the details of the current relationship. I think 2022 was the highest level of this romantic approach prevailing, or the mixture of the romantic approach with the pragmatic approach, because support for Ukraine in Poland was not just seen as morally and ethically right, but also as something that now strengthened the interests and the security of the country. Some call it the heroics period, that you had insane, almost post-Soviet levels of support. 90% plus of the Poles support Ukraine. More than 70% declared that they somehow also personally helped Ukrainians. In Ukraine, 90% of Ukrainians basically treat Poland as the partner number one. But this romantic period, a heroic period, could not last forever. And right now I can see the two-level game, at least on the part of the Polish authorities. One level is this strategic support to Ukraine, also in the military logistics sense, but also one level down, hard bargaining. Hard bargaining based on the assessment of interests in areas as agriculture, economic relationship situation at the border. It's very difficult to actually conduct this policy at both levels. That on the one hand, you are saying our support is 100%, but then when we talk about the situation of agricultural project, actually we bargain hard based on our interests. So, and then you have the public group of interests, I would say, but very powerful one. In terms of the public opinion, right now you have 70% support for Ukraine, not 90%. It's still pretty high, but it's not the crazy levels from 2020-22.
Okay. We're going to have to stop there because Baroness Ashton is waiting to come on, and we need to keep things vaguely on track. But I know people have questions. Find people in coffee breaks. One of the things that has struck me, many things have struck me about this brilliant panel. One of them is that 2014, in all of your talks, comes across as a rejection of something, a decisive rejection of a way of thinking, of a way of doing government, of a way of thinking outside of Ukraine as much as in it. It's not certain that it had a coherent positive position. and the last decade has been seeking that positive position. It is clear from all of your talks that we need to move much faster in developing that positive vision and help Ukraine to do so. So I've learned a huge amount in the last hour and a quarter. I'm going to hand over, but all that remains is to thank 3 outstanding talks and outstanding panelists. Thank you all so much.